College was left behind, a bright but quickly faded dream. In my hands, I held a business diploma smelling of fresh printer's ink, and in my chest, a vague anxiety as I crossed the threshold of my childhood home once again. My name is Anna. I am 22 years old, and to be honest, I had not planned on returning under my parents' roof. Life, however, had decided otherwise, and here I was, in my old room, where the wallpaper still showed the faded marks of posters once glued to it, and outside the window, the birch trees, familiar from childhood, rustled their branches as always. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy. The job search, to my own surprise, did not take long. Fate seemed to have taken pity on me for a moment. Within a week, I had an offer to take a position in the marketing department of a solid company, Davidson. The salary was quite decent, and the promising performance bonuses lured with the phantom of financial independence. That evening smelled of my mother's meatloaf, its thick, cozy aroma filling the entire kitchen. At dinner, trying to speak calmly and matter-of-factly, I shared the news. I announced that I would stay here, at most, for 3 months to save up some initial capital and finally rent my own apartment. At that very moment, the clinking of forks against porcelain plates, that quiet accompaniment to our family meals, abruptly ceased. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, and I unmistakably read in their looks that silent anxiety which always foreshadowed problems related to my attempts to gain my wings. Mom slowly, with exaggerated care, set down her cutlery. "Anna, you know that, because of my back, I can only manage a part-time position at the library," she said, and a tired note sounded in her voice. Dad, in turn, cleared his throat, as if preparing the ground for a difficult admission. "And at the plant," he began, looking somewhere past me, "things are, to put it mildly, not brilliant. There are rumors of upcoming layoffs. Your help with the bills would be very useful." Mom quietly, almost in a whisper, added, "You won't have to pay rent here. It's easier, right?" I stared at my unfinished piece of meatloaf, having suddenly lost all appetite. A feeling, sharp and unpleasant, tightened my throat. I was trapped. A trap of debt, family ties, and silent expectations. But there was an undeniable logic in their words, and after all, these were my parents. "All right," I surrendered, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. I suppose I could stay a bit longer. Life, like a river returning to its old bed, settled into a calm, predictable routine. The days lined up in a monotonous sequence: work, returning home, paying bills, while Mom, like a good fairy, invariably ensured that dinner was always on the table. A fragile but sturdy order seemed to have been established, and it could have continued for a long time, perhaps even until last weekend, when my sister Sarah appeared at the house with her husband Mike and their children, 4-year-old Emma and little Lucas. The transformation that came over my parents was so instantaneous and complete, as if someone had flicked an invisible switch, releasing streams of untapped tenderness. "Oh, my precious little angels!" Mom exclaimed, scooping Emma into her arms, while Dad, looking 20 years younger, seated a giggling Lucas on his shoulders. "Sarah, darling, you look absolutely wonderful. How are you? Tell us everything you've been up to." They showered her with questions, their faces radiant with undivided attention and love. I stood frozen in the doorway, an invisible shadow against the bright backdrop of their family happiness, and watched as my parents gazed adoringly at their eldest daughter and her beautiful little family. They hung on her every word, asking with genuine interest about the most mundane things: how her vegetable garden was doing, what new words Lucas had learned, whether her book club had disbanded. They never, I felt this with a new, piercing sharpness, showed a fraction of such lively interest in my life, not even when I made the dean's list or won a prestigious leadership award in business school. "Anna, be a dear, please make some coffee." Mom tossed over her shoulder without even looking at me, entirely absorbed in bouncing Lucas on her knee. Standing at the kitchen stove that day, listening to the peals of carefree laughter from the living room, I couldn't push away the flood of memories. Always, absolutely always, it had been like this. Sarah, who was 7 years older than me, had always been the main star of our family constellation, while I was assigned the role of an extra, forever in the shadows. I remembered sitting at this very kitchen table when I was just 11, proudly showing Mom my report card covered in top grades. She gave it a distracted glance and, without a single word of praise, immediately returned to passionately discussing Sarah's upcoming university applications with her. "That's very nice, Anna," came her absent-minded dismissal before she turned back to my sister. "Sarah, darling, tell me, which universities are you considering first?" Those years, all of my childhood and adolescence, were entirely dedicated to Sarah's academic and personal achievements. Every dinner conversation invariably revolved around her grades, her extracurricular activities, her exam preparations. I just sat there, silent and invisible, methodically chewing my peas, while Mom and Dad hung on Sarah's every word about her advanced placement courses and campus tour impressions. This invisible family dynamic established over the years became even more pronounced and unchallengeable when Sarah went off to university. I was barely 11 then, and I still remember that evening conversation as if it happened yesterday. I sat staring at my plate while they beamed. "We're so proud of you, darling," Mom exclaimed, tears of genuine joy glistening in her eyes. She looked at Father. "We'll manage, won't we, Robert?" Dad nodded solemnly, his face expressing grim determination. "Of course we'll manage. We'll take out a student loan. Our Sarah deserves the best possible education." The air in the room was thick with their love and sacrifice, and I, at 11, vaguely understood what this meant for me. A week after Sarah was driven off to college, they sat me down for a conversation of a completely different kind. "Anna," Dad began, his voice sounding unusually stern, "we'll have to tighten our belts for a while. The loan payments and college expenses for Sarah will be quite significant." And then everything truly changed. My classmates flaunted new phones while I carefully preserved my old flip phone until the plastic casing cracked and the screen went dark forever. When I needed new clothes, we didn't go to the mall but to thrift stores that smelled of mothballs and other people's lives. Even Christmas presents became strictly practical: socks, pens, notebooks, but they never forgot to send money to Sarah. "Your sister needs to focus on her studies," Mom would say, writing out another check with an expression as if performing a sacred rite. "We can't have her worrying about money." I learned this bitter lesson very early. At 15, I joined every possible club and participated in every academic competition I could find. I studied late into the night, striving not just for good, but for flawless grades. I wrote essays for scholarship contests until my fingers went numb from fatigue, because I knew the only way to avoid a student loan was to earn my education myself. I succeeded. I got a full scholarship to State University, and I still remember the wave of relief that flashed across my parents' faces when I told them they wouldn't have to spend a single cent on my education. Meanwhile, Sarah graduated with honors, landed a prestigious job in Brighton, and quickly married Mike, her college sweetheart. Within the next 2 years, Emma and Lucas joined her. My parents were over the moon. Their perfect daughter had created a perfect family. And now, every one of her monthly visits turned into the same exhausting routine. Sarah and Mike would appear on the doorstep with the kids and their things, and before I could even greet anyone, Sarah would already be outlining the weekend plans. "Anna, you'll look after Emma and Lucas while Mike and I go shopping, right?" she'd state, not so much asking as stating a fact. There wasn't a shadow of doubt in her tone. The first few times, I timidly suggested that our parents could babysit. "Oh, honey," Mom would reply, tenderly patting my back but with unwavering resolve in her eyes. "You know perfectly well with my back it's hard to keep up with little children, and your father simply needs to rest on the weekends." And so, I'd spend another Saturday watching Frozen for the 100th time with Emma, while Lucas enthusiastically tried to redecorate the wallpaper in my very own bedroom. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mike enjoyed a restaurant lunch with friends and our parents. They strolled leisurely in the garden, occasionally peeking into the room to ask if I needed anything. They said it with a tone as if they were granting me a great favor by agreeing to a momentary conversation. I tried to console myself with the thought that it was just one weekend a month, just one weekend of being a free and reliable babysitter while everyone else lived their lives. A year passed in this monotonous, draining rhythm. Monthly scheduled babysitting duties, endless bills, the quiet sense of obligation that had become the background of my life. I had almost grown accustomed to this role of the perpetual helper, invisible and convenient. And then, one such evening, as I was washing the dishes after dinner, a phone call came that turned my already complicated life upside down. From the kitchen came Mom's surprised, immediately alarmed voice. "Sarah? Oh, sweetheart, don't cry. Calm down. Tell me what's wrong." The tap water continued to run over my hands, but I froze, listening to the fragments of the conversation. Through sobs, Sarah explained that Mike's company had suddenly gone bankrupt, without any warning. They were broke, unable to pay rent, and with no financial cushion. "Could we maybe stay with you for a while?" My sister's voice was so loud on the speakerphone that I heard every word with painful clarity. "Of course you can," Mom exclaimed without a hint of hesitation, and her words sent a chill through me, as if my stomach had suddenly emptied. "We'll make space, darling, don't you worry." I stepped forward into the doorway, clearing my throat nervously. If they're moving in," I began, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "Maybe now is the perfect time for me to finally rent my own apartment? To free up space. You would have thought I had suggested burning the house down." Mom looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Anna, don't talk nonsense," she snapped, her eyebrows rising in indignation. "There's enough room for everyone." "We're family," Dad added firmly and categorically without looking up from his newspaper. "In difficult times, we stick together." They arrived the very next weekend, a whole caravan of 3 cars packed to the roof with their belongings. I spent all of Saturday moving my modest belongings into the former storage room. The smallest room in the house, smelling of dust and mustiness, barely fit a narrow single bed and an old dresser. My former twice-as-large room was solemnly converted into a nursery because, as Mom declared, the children need space to play. Emma, now 5, and Lucas, a 3-year-old whirlwind, were given the entire house as their personal playground. They raced through the hallways, their piercing shrieks and laughter deafening, while Sarah, settled in the living room, watched TV at full volume or relentlessly discussed with her friends on the phone how difficult this forced transition had been for her. "Emma, Lucas, quiet!" I would shout when they burst into my cubbyhole for the 10th time in the morning, scattering important work papers on the floor. "They're just playing, Anna," Sarah would say condescendingly, not even looking up from her phone screen. "Don't be such a grump." After a long day at the office, all I wanted was solitude and quiet in my room. Instead, I listened to endless replays of Baby Shark coming through the thin walls, the pitter-patter of little feet, and Sarah's loud, booming laughter at some TV joke. Mike spent his days ostensibly actively job hunting, but I more often saw him sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his news feed on his phone with a concerned look. "The job market is very tough right now," he'd justify himself when Dad asked an awkward question. "But I'm sure something will come up soon." Every night I lay in my tiny bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the chaos that had now become my home. I caught myself thinking, with bitter astonishment, how I had allowed myself to end up in this situation. But every time the resolve to bring up moving out again began to form within me. The disapproving, almost frightened face of my mother and the stern expression of my father would appear before my eyes, and the words would get stuck in my throat, never finding their way out. The first utility bill that arrived after Sarah's family moved in was a blow to the gut. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the numbers that seemed cartoonishly inflated. The total was almost double the usual amount. The water bill alone had increased catastrophically, not to mention electricity and heating, as if dozens of appliances were running in the house around the clock. Looking at the modest figures in my bank account, I realized with painful clarity how my carefully laid plans to save for my own housing were beginning to melt away at an alarming rate, dissolving into this financial sinkhole. That evening at dinner, to the accompaniment of the now familiar chaos, I decided to broach the delicate subject. Helplessly pushing peas around my plate with a fork, I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking, "Since last month, the utility bills have doubled. I can't cover all the bills alone anymore. It's taking almost my entire salary." Sarah's fork clattered against her porcelain plate with a sharp, unpleasant clang. "Are you seriously complaining about money right now, when Mike and I have lost absolutely everything?" Her voice rose, filling with hysterical notes. "I'm not complaining." I tried to hold my ground, feeling my throat tighten. "I'm just trying to find a fair way to distribute the expenses." "I can't believe how selfish you are," she interrupted, her words cutting deep. "We're going through the most difficult period of our lives, and all you can think about is your precious money." "Sarah is right, Anna," Mom instantly chimed in, her gaze firm and condemning. "Family helps family. That's what we do." Dad, in turn, nodded solemnly, reinforcing her words. "Your sister and Mike need our support right now. This is not the time to count pennies." I lowered my gaze to my plate, forcing down the lump of resentment and bitterness rising in my throat. "Fine," I whispered, feeling utterly defeated. "Never mind." A week later, to everyone's joy, Mike finally got a job at an insurance company. The salary was significantly lower than his previous position, but as everyone kept saying, it was something. A faint hope flickered in me that maybe things would start to get better now. I was terribly mistaken. "It's so hard to be alone with the kids all day," Sarah began complaining almost immediately. "Mike leaves at 8 and doesn't get back until 6. I never have a minute's break." And then came the small, seemingly innocent requests. "Anna, could you watch the kids for an hour while I run to the store? Anna, could you sit with them while I take a shower?" Before I knew it, these innocent favors had grown into something constant and burdensome. I would come home from work and find Sarah already dressed to go out. "Oh, great, you're home," she'd say, grabbing her purse. "Mike and I are meeting friends for dinner. Emma and Lucas have already had a snack, but they'll need dinner in an hour. We'll be back by 10. The weekends turned into my personal nightmare. On Friday evenings, Sarah and Mike would casually announce their plans as a matter of course. Shopping with friends, dinner in the city, going to the movies. They would leave me with the children for hours on end. Mom and Dad conveniently began visiting relatives more often, disappearing from the house as if on cue right after Sarah and Mike left. So, weekend after weekend, I tried to stop Emma from creating art on the wallpaper, while Lucas threw another tantrum because I had cut his sandwich wrong. I spent Saturdays picking up scattered toys, preparing endless servings of mac and cheese, and watching the same children's movies. By Sunday evening, I was completely exhausted, both mentally and physically. The house resembled a battlefield, and I still had to cook dinner for the whole crowd. One evening, after a particularly draining weekend spent in the role of a free nanny, I gathered the last of my courage and dared to bring it up at dinner. "I need to talk to all of you," I said, putting down my fork and feeling my hands tremble. "I'm very tired. This situation with the constant babysitting, it's not working for me." Sarah's head jerked up, and her eyes, which just a moment ago had been looking adoringly at our parents, narrowed into two dangerous slits. "What do you mean? Not working?" Her voice became slick and cold. "Are you saying you don't want to spend time with your own niece and nephew?" Mom immediately reached out and patted Sarah's wrist soothingly. "Don't worry, darling," she said, giving me a reproachful look. "Actually, it's good practice for Anna. She'll need to know how to handle children when she becomes a mother herself someday. Consider it training." Her words, spoken with such casual certainty, hung in the air, finally burying my attempts to get through. And just like that, as if nothing had happened, they smoothly returned to their usual ritual. Sarah, beaming again, began telling some insignificant story from her day, while Mom and Dad, as if hypnotized, hung on her every word, and Mike nodded approvingly. I sat there again, invisible and mute, aimlessly pushing the cooling food around my plate and feeling the walls of the room slowly closing in on me. After that failed conversation, nothing changed. If anything, the situation worsened. Sarah and Mike seemed to have taken my complaint as a personal challenge, and now, with almost demonstrative persistence, found more and more reasons to disappear from the house. They began waiting for me right at the door when I returned from work, already holding their car keys. "We're meeting friends at that new restaurant downtown," they'd say, already halfway out the door. "The kids have already eaten. Thanks, Anna." The weekends became something I started dreading from Monday morning. I'd wake up on Saturday with a heavy, unpleasant knot in my stomach, knowing with bitter certainty that the next 2 days would be marked by endless episodes of Paw Patrol and exhausting children's squabbles that I had to mediate, while Sarah and Mike lived their best lives carefree. And then came that Wednesday that changed everything. I was sitting at my desk, struggling to concentrate on a marketing report through a haze of accumulated fatigue, when my colleague and friend Rachel peeked into my cubicle. "Hey, want to do something fun this weekend?" she asked, perching on the edge of my desk. "A bunch of us are going to the Pine Ridge Ski Resort. Just for a couple of days. Leave Saturday morning, back Sunday evening. They say the slopes are just perfect right now." For the first time in many months, I felt a faint but genuine spark of excitement in my chest. And so, on Friday evening, I was in my tiny bedroom, packing warm clothes into a travel bag with a light heart, genuinely looking forward to the trip. I was just neatly folding my thickest knit sweater when Sarah appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" she asked, her gaze falling on my half-packed bag. "Packing," I replied, continuing to pack thermal socks. "I'm going to Pine Ridge with some friends from work. Skiing." Sarah's face instantly darkened, as if a shadow had fallen over it. "You need to cancel your trip," she stated in a flat, brooking no argument tone. I looked up at her, stunned by the audacity. "Why on earth?" "Because," she said, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, "Mike and I are going to Aunt Linda's 60th birthday in Millbrook. Mom and Dad are going too. You need to stay here with Emma and Lucas." I couldn't suppress a short, nervous laugh. "Are you kidding me?" I exhaled, not stopping my packing of ski pants. "You can't seriously expect me to cancel my own plans at the last minute just because you couldn't be bothered to tell me about yours." Sarah's face flushed a deep crimson with anger. "This isn't funny, Anna," she hissed. "You're being completely unreasonable." "No, unreasonable," I retorted, finally looking up and meeting her gaze directly, "is expecting me to drop everything at a moment's notice to be your personal, free nanny, over and over again." Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, her face contorted with silent fury. She hissed something inaudible, then sharply, as if propelled by a spring, turned and ran out of my room. "Mom, Dad, Mike!" Her piercing, hysterical shriek came from the hallway. "You won't believe what Anna is doing now." I continued mechanically packing my bag, feeling my whole body tremble finely and treacherously from the surge of adrenaline and accumulated anger. The thunder of hurried footsteps heralded the approach of a whole delegation. My tiny cubbyhole suddenly felt even more claustrophobic as Sarah, Mike, and my parents crowded into it, filling all the space. Mom's face was already twisted into a mask of deep, familiar disappointment. "Is it true?" she demanded, planting her hands on her hips. "You're planning to go skiing?" Her tone was as if I had announced my intention to commit an armed robbery. "Exactly," I replied, forcefully zipping up my sports bag. "I'm going to the Pine Ridge Resort with friends for the weekend." "But you can't," Sarah blurted out, her voice rising to a shriek again. "We have Aunt Linda's party." "No," I corrected her, slowly turning and surveying the whole silent scene. "You have Aunt Linda's party. Why am I only hearing about it now? Why wasn't I even informed, included in the plans?" Mom shifted nervously, looking uncomfortable for the first time that evening. Sarah, however, snorted, and her voice took on its familiar condescension. "We all discussed it," she declared, as if that explained everything, "and decided this was best for everyone. We go to the party, you watch the kids. It's the most logical arrangement. We all discussed it," I repeated slowly with emphasis. without me, and decided what I would be doing on my weekend. How convenient. Well, you can't drag small children to a sophisticated party, Sarah snorted. Aunt Linda specifically said, no children. I slung my packed travel bag over my shoulder. Its weight felt surprisingly good. That sounds like your problem, Sarah. They're your children. Do you even understand what this means? Mike finally entered the conversation, furrowing his thick eyebrows. It means exactly what it sounds like. I have plans. I'm going skiing. Your children are your responsibility, not mine. If you can't take them with you, either don't go or hire a babysitter. A babysitter, Sarah shrieked. With what money, may I ask? Again, not my problem. I cut her off, turning to face them all and suddenly feeling stronger than I had in all the past months, maybe even years. Let me make this clear once and for all. Tomorrow, I am leaving to go skiing. I am no longer your free and convenient babysitter. I will no longer tolerate the theft of my weekends, the dismissal of my plans, and the disregard for my life. If you need childcare, Sarah, that is your direct responsibility as a parent. Stop assuming I will always be on call to solve your problems. A deathly, deafening silence fell in the room. Everyone stared at me with expressions as if I had suddenly started speaking in ancient Sumerian. Sarah's mouth opened and closed helplessly, like a fish out of water. Mom looked as if she had been hit over the head with a blunt object. Dad seemed to be trying to become part of the doorframe and dissolve into it. And Mike just stood there with the same bewildered, lost expression he'd had since his company went bankrupt. The shocked silence didn't last long. Sarah's face contorted, crumpled, and she burst into loud, theatrical sobs, covering her face with her hands. Mike muttered something under his breath, but in the silence, it was surprisingly clear. Ungrateful. Mom's voice, trembling with indignation, cut through the heavy pause. After all we've done for you, you're behaving completely irresponsibly, selfishly. Dad, standing behind her, just shook his head in disappointment, and his silent condemnation was louder than any words. Absolutely selfish. I stood there, feeling the weight of the travel bag on my shoulder, and watched as my own family turned into a cohesive Greek chorus, performing my indictment. Words, sharp and honed like daggers, rained down on me from all sides. Selfish, ungrateful, inconsiderate, immature. Each one was meant to hurt, to put me in my place, to return me to the familiar bounds of compliance. And then Mom delivered the blow that, in her mind, was meant to be the knockout. If you step over that threshold tomorrow, she said with icy solemnity, don't bother coming back to this house. To everyone's astonishment, I burst out laughing. It wasn't a strained, nervous chuckle, but a real, loud, liberating laugh coming from the depths of my soul. They looked at me as if I were insane. You know what's funny about that? I said, wiping the tears of laughter from my eyes. For months, if not years, I've dreamed of moving out of this house. I just lacked the final push, the resolve. And now you've given me the perfect reason. So thank you, Mom. Get out, Sarah shrieked, her fake sobs instantly replaced by rage. Just get the hell out. I took out my phone and, without taking my eyes off them, dialed Rachel's number, putting it on speaker so my words would ring through the house. Hey, Rach, sorry to bother you so late. Is that offer to stay with you for a bit still open? I mean, not just after skiing, but maybe for a few days ahead. My friend's cheerful, energetic voice sounded in the tomb-like silence of the room. Of course, I've got a spare room. Come over whenever. It'd be perfect. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said clearly and hung up. The next 15 minutes I spent rapidly packing my essential belongings into bags and boxes. Clothes, important documents, cherished trinkets. They watched me from various doorways, silent and stunned, as if unable to believe that their play of threats and manipulations had finally failed. When the last box was loaded into the trunk, I returned to the living room where they were still standing in the same silent grouping. Oh, and one more thing, I said, my voice surprisingly even and calm. Since I no longer live here, I obviously won't be paying your bills. You'll have to figure out how to support this household yourselves. Mom's face went white. But the utilities, the groceries. "That's no longer my problem," I cut her off, repeating my own words, and turning around, I walked out the front door, deliberately ignoring the suddenly panicked, almost pleading calls from my mother that followed me. The drive to Rachel's house was like a breath of fresh air after long suffocation, adrenaline mixed with a feeling of incredible, dizzying relief. My phone was blowing up with calls and messages, angry tirades from Sarah, guilt-tripping lamentations from Mom, stern, disappointed voicemails from Dad. I ignored them all. The next morning, Rachel and I, as planned, set off for Pine Ridge. For the first time in a long, long eternity, I spent the weekend as I wanted. We skied, laughed until we cried, warmed ourselves by the fireplace with mugs of hot chocolate, and I didn't have to worry about someone else's children or someone else's problems a single time. And when we returned on Sunday evening, I opened my laptop and with a new, strengthened sense of determination, began browsing rental sites. After all, my salary no longer had to dissolve into the bottomless barrel of family needs. It finally belonged only to me. By Wednesday of the following week, after carefully studying all the options and soberly assessing my finances, I was finally able to afford a decent, albeit modest, place to live. I found a small but surprisingly bright one-bedroom apartment in a quiet, well-kept neighborhood, just a 20-minute leisurely drive from the office. My first week within the new walls was like relearning to breathe deeply after a long illness. Every morning I woke up in blessed, ringing silence, with no piercing children's shrieks, no deafening TV roar, no oppressive, unspoken sense of guilt emanating from my mother. I could slowly brew coffee and drink it unhurriedly, enjoying every sip while it was scalding hot. I spent evenings immersed in books or watching whatever I wanted without having to glance over my shoulder at anyone's disapproval. Messages from my family continued to arrive, a persistent and annoying stream. I didn't answer the calls, but I couldn't resist reading them. They followed a predictable, almost theatrical pattern. "Mom, how could you abandon your family like this? We need you." Sarah, "You're so selfish. The kids keep asking where Aunt Anna is." Dad, "Your mother is very upset. You need to fix this." They cycled between suffocating attempts to induce guilt, outright manipulation, and angry, accusatory tirades. I read them all, letting the poison wash over me, but didn't respond to a single one. My silence seemed to drive them even crazier. They were clearly not used to being deprived of power over me. After a week of this informational pressure, I was sitting on my new sofa, bought with my first independent paycheck, when Mom's number lit up my phone screen again. This time, something clicked inside, and I decided to answer. "Anna, finally." Mother's voice sounded sharp and reproachful. "I can't believe you ruined our entire weekend. Aunt Linda's party was completely spoiled because of your selfish behavior. Sarah and Mike couldn't come because you refused to babysit." I didn't let her continue. "Just stop." My voice was quiet, but it held a steel I didn't know I possessed. "I've had enough, Mom. I'm done. I'm tired of being treated like a servant in my own home. I'm tired of sacrificing my time, my money, my life for everyone else's convenience. I'm tired of being the family ATM and free nanny while being treated as if I don't matter." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end, and when Mom spoke again, her tone had changed, becoming wheedling and ingratiating, the one I knew so well. "Sweetheart, I know things haven't been perfect, but we're family. We need you. The bills. This month is very hard for us without your help. No, Mom, I'm done. Maybe someday we can build a new relationship, but it will be on equal terms. No more manipulation. No more guilt trips. Don't treat me like a walking wallet or a free childcare service. Until then, I need space to live my own life." I hung up and immediately, without giving myself time to doubt, blocked her number. Then I took my phone and methodically, one by one, blocked them all. Mom, Dad, Sarah, even Mike. I disconnected from them on social media, severing the last digital threads. The feeling was both frightening and incredibly liberating, as if I had cut the heavy anchor ropes I hadn't even realized were holding me in place. Maybe someday in the future, I'll be ready to have my family back in my life. Maybe with time and distance, we can build something new, something healthier, with clear boundaries and mutual respect. Or maybe not. But either way, I was no longer going to sacrifice my own happiness and mental well-being to satisfy their endless, insatiable demands.